the last verse ay ating pag-alaman ang katawagan ni Apostol Pablo to limit the liberty for the sake of weaker brother. Ito yung tungkol sa pagkain ng pinag-usapan dito. Chapter 9, verse 1 to 40, to 27 actually is the example of this type of limited liberty in the ministry of Paul. So Paul make an example to the Corinthian brothers with regards to limiting the liberty. So in chapter 9, verses 1 to 14, Paul has the right to be paid in his ministry. But he continued here in 15 to 27 that he limit his liberty for the sake of the Corinthian brothers and sisters. So he did not ask for to be paid in his ministry. And that is limiting his ministry, limiting his liberty by not asking for salary or support in the church of the Corinthians. So now in 15 to 27, he gives us the reason for limiting his right. But I have used none of these things, referring to his discussion of his right to be paid in his ministry. And I am not writing these things that I may be done so in my case, for it will be better for me to die than have any man make my boast an empty one. So dito, sinasabi ni Apostol Pablo, so one of the liberties that Paul has limited is the liberty to be financially compensated for his work. In preaching the gospel. Now he point out that he has not partaken of that right. In other words, he did not exercise that right asking for compensation or support of what he is doing for them. And so in this case, in part of this, the regularity of Paul practice. But I have used none of those things. So Paul's regular practice in ministry was that he generally did not take money for those whom he was ministering. So if you recall in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 9, the same practice that he said that he did that to the church in Thessalonica. He said, "For your recall, brethren, our labor and hardship, how working right and day, so as not to be burdened to any of you, we proclaim to you the gospel of God." So Paul worked day and night to support himself, and that is what he's saying. And also in Thessalonians chapter 2 Thessalonians chapter 7 or chapter 3 verse 7 to 9 is said, "For yourself know how you ought to follow, for example, because we did not act in an undisciplined manner among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it. But with labor and hardship, we keep working night and day, so that you may not be burdened to any of you. Not because we do not have the right to do this, but in order to offer ourselves as a model for you, that you might follow our example. So here is an example Paul telling the church in Thessalonica, and it is always his practice to work, to support himself, to preach the gospel. And he encouraged the brethren there in Thessalonica to follow their example. Also in Acts chapter 20, verse 34 to 35, you yourself know that these hands ministered to you, to my own needs, and to the men who were with me. In everything I showed you that by working hard in this manner, you must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus Christ, that he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. So Paul worked as a tent maker to support himself and his entire missionary team. So this men working long hours for him. And so, and this is what he is telling the leaders in the church at Corinth. So we know that some of our brothers and sisters are working in the church full-time or part-time, and they're supporting themselves. There's nothing wrong with that. And it's nothing wrong being supported too in the church. But Paul is limiting his right. Every preacher has the right to be supported by the congregation that they are preaching. But they limit their right not to receiving compensation from the brethren while they're working with them. And so the reason for Paul relating to the practice, and I'm not writing these things that it may be done so in my case, for it will be better for me to die than have any man make my boast on my empty. So Paul is writing them actually not asking for money actually. So Paul is given a compelling reason. Let me see that I put. So Paul has used none of the foregoing reason to give the Corinthians to support him materially. And he did not want his readers to interpret or the Corinthian what he had said on the subject as a real request for support. He had made his decision to support himself while he preached his own accord. So the Lord did not require this of him. And so, meaning he's not asking for, he has a ministry. So Paul is not, or rather Paul in his ministry is not asking money to the Corinthian church when he wrote this. You know, the context is this is still discussing about the limiting our right for the weak brother. So this is still a continuation of his discussions with that. Now, this is an example that he limited himself for the sake of the Corinthian church. So you remember that the Greek culture, let me see that I put notice that there. So remember that the Greek culture which the Corinthian Christian are actually approve so much, they look down those who work manually, manual labor. Even though the Corinthian Christian seems to think less of Paul because he worked with his own hand to support himself, it does not embarrass Paul at all. Actually, he will boast about it. So sometimes we have that to our brothers who sometimes do work, to support the ministry, and they are boasting about it, that they can do it without the support of the congregation that they are uh, serving. We know that a lot in the Philippines, that most of the congregations could not support their ministry, their ministers. Some of the ministers or preachers are partly supporting themselves to work in that congregations. And sometimes they are boasting about that. And this is what Paul is saying, that I can do it without the support of the brethren. So the reason for Paul said, Paul, and I am not writing these things that it may be done so in my case, meaning he is not asking for support. So I'm not writing these things. Paul has the right to be supported, but he did not use that right. That it may be done so in my case. In his writing, Paul was not make a clue or hinting for support by the Corinthian Christian. He is not, tawag natin yan, nagpadaplis, no? Ng salita para sa suportahin. He shows them the value and the reason for giving up his own right of asking a support from them. So he said, it will be better for me to die for any man to make my boast empty. So Paul is boasting was not that he preached the gospel. He has to do that because he was called by God. Instead, his boasting was that he was able to do it without asking his hearer or the Corinthian for support. So anyway, so in the next section, the compulsion of Paul call. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For I am under compulsion. Woe is for me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have stewardship entrusted to me, what then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my rights in the gospel. Again, Paul is still a part of his reasoning why he is not asking for supporters. So he's limiting his right. So Paul was not just sitting around in Jerusalem contemplating for his career as a minister, but he's going to a ministry that is entrusted to him by God. And so let me see that. So the compulsion of Paul is a need to to preach. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. Who for me if I do not preach the gospel? So we said before, the previous discussions that we had, that Paul is not boasting about his preaching to the gospel, but his boasting is that he is not supported by the brethren in his work of preaching the gospel, because he was called by God. No? So Paul's ministry was not just a matter of choice or a personal ambition. It was something he was called to do, something he has to do. He was called to preach and feel compelled to fulfill that call. And so he chose as his calling to preach the gospel. So Paul did not receive any authority from other apostles in Jerusalem. It is God who called him in when he was called by God in his travel to Damascus while he is persecuting the Christian. So a reward attitude. So the reason that Paul is preaching the gospel is for the reward. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward. Of course, it does not mean that a full-time preacher supported by the congregation has no reward. We have all reward. But Paul emphasized that his attitude of preaching the gospel is because of the reward of preaching the gospel. If you preach the gospel willingly, he would receive a reward or pay from the Lord. If he preached unwillingly, he would not receive a reward because he would only be doing his duty as a steward or manager of the household. So the difference between the willingness and unwillingness to preach the gospel. Of course, we have some brothers and sisters that sometimes because of their willingness to preach the gospel, they were supported by a congregation that has a money to support them, although they are not serving that congregation. So sa mga kapatid natin, no, huwag kayo mawala ng pag-asa. No? Pag wala kayong support, then you will receive a support from the Lord. God will look for your support. As long as you're working willingly. But if you are working as it is unwillingly, or someone volunteered for you for do that, then you do that as your duty for that person. So Paul has no duty from his fellow apostle. He voluntarily preached the gospel because he was called by God. And one of these reasons because of the reward. So a stewardship entrusted. For if I do this voluntarily, I have a reward in verse 17. But if against my will, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. So Paul's reward for preaching the gospel willingly was the privilege of preaching it without charge to his audience. His highest pay was the privilege of preaching without pay. This choice may seem as though it was Paul's decision rather than a reward from the Lord. But he viewed it as a privilege or reward that come to him from the Lord. So the Paul Paul sayings about the reward is his privilege. So he was honored to preach the gospel without being paid by the congregation that he served. So that is what is, we know that, no, the feeling of working in a congregation that the congregation does not pay you. You are honored by that. That is your reward. No? People respect you in that congregation. Although some congregation pay your support for preaching, a congregation that does not support you, it is an honorable decision. And that reward actually is that you feel good. You know? The rewards that being honored and respected by that congregation. And that is what Paul is telling us. So the basis of reward, what then is my reward? In verse 18, then when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. So again, Paul is emphasizing here that he has the right to be supported by the Corinthian church, but he did not ask for that. So he asked a question, what is my reward then? So Paul, how did Paul go above and beyond the call of duty? Paul has the right to an apostle. He was free to insist on them if he chose to do so or asking for support from the Corinthian church. But he also had the freedom not to insist on them, meaning he has the right or freedom not to ask money. This is the argument that Paul is using because some of the leaders of the church in Corinth is questioning his apostleship because he was not supported by the church in his work. His argument is that is his right. He has the right to ask for support, but he also has the right not to ask for them to support him. In both cases, it was the welfare of others that led him to forego the right. So he exercising both of his right is in the benefit of the Corinthian church. Not, he's not a burden to them while he is working with them. So he chose not to be paid for preaching them. Just as he was willing to sacrifice his salary for the sake of the gospel, so this Christian must be willing to refrain from the use of such meat. No? So he's still discussing about exercising your right, not eating meat that's sold from the market for the sake of a weak Christian. So Paul make his sacrifices, not receiving salary for them, as an exercise, or rather as an example of limiting his right, as he encouraged them to limit their rights in eating so in the previous chapter, Paul was insisting that one must refrain from something which are morally indifferent for the sake of a weaker brother. And that is eating food, food that is part of the worship, what do you call that, the part of those sacrifice in the temple of the Gentile. So here he insists that one must at time refrain for the sake of his work. So doon sa Corinto, for the sake of his brother. Sa kanya, for the sake of his work. His work is to preach the gospel. So the sacrifice that Paul's freedom in verses 19 to 23. For though I am free from all men, I may have made myself a slave to all, that I might win the more. Unto the Jews I become a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without the law, or without the law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. For to the weak I become weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may all means some save some. And I do that, and I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a fellow partakers of that. So Paul maintained or has maintained that liberty so that the Christian also enjoy that liberty. What liberty? He is free. So every Christian is free. They are liberty. They have liberty. So what do we mean by this? By saying that the Christian is free to do whatever is not forbidden, as long it does not go against his conscience. So we are free to do things that are not forbidden. But of course, Paul still make a sacrifice of his liberty not to ask money for the brethren. Still continue discussion for his right, and that is his sacrifice. So the sacrifice of full freedom, verses 19 to 23. He said, for the weak I am weak, that I may win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may all by all means some save some. And I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a fellow partaker of it. So Paul the sacrifice of his freedom is that he may save some in preaching the gospel. So here, Paul gave 3 examples of how he has sacrificed his freedom for the benefits of the others. So to the Jews, he became a Jew. To the Gentile, he became a Gentile. To the weak, he became a weak. So he gave us his liberty because to save others, to win some more to Christ. So in its case, Paul ends the example by giving a reason that he sacrificed his freedom. In its case, he said that I might win the more. meaning that I may win some people, to the Jews, to the Gentile, and to the weak, that he may be able to win them to Christ. So he has the freedom, but he set an example of that liberty not to exercise. To the Jews, a Jew to the Jews. In verse 20, to the Jews I become a Jew that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. So of course, Paul is not under the law of Moses, but he is under the law of Christ. But although he is not under the law, he set an example in order to win the Jews. So Paul realized that he is no longer bound by the legal ceremonies and customs of Mosaical law. He already free from that. He is now fulfilling the law of Christ who died to fulfill the requirements of the law. And so we are not no longer under its rule, the Old Testament. Although he was free, Paul often limited his liberty by following the Jewish custom when he was dealing with the Jews. An example of that, to outside observer, it might be looked at that Paul is inconsistent with his teaching. But he is consistently pursue one goal, to win people to Jesus. So in Acts chapter 21, verse 23 to 26, actually, let me see that. Yes. Paul participated in the Jewish purification ceremony, which he knew were not necessary for his own life, but he hoped will help build a bridge of ministry to the Jews as well. In Acts chapter 16, verse 3, Paul had Timothy circumcised. He don't need Timothy to be circumcised, but he did it so that it will be helpful in getting ministry done among the Jews. But Titus, the company of Paul, was not circumcised because it is not necessary for Titus in his ministry for the Gentiles. So Paul allowed Timothy to be circumcised, although he was not supposed to be, just to win the Jews. This is one of the examples that Paul telling us that he, to the Jew, a Jew to the Jews. And so this is how our approach to certain, we know that in our evangelism, our approach entirely different to a person that we are teaching. So to Paul, if you are a Jew, so Paul is practice some of these purification ceremonies. Like, for example, the some people at this time, they're taking the Nazarite vow. What is Nazarite vow? It is a Jewish ritual that the person is not cutting his hair And that is a vow that is doing that. In Acts chapter 21, verse 26, then Paul took men and women the next day, purifying himself along with them, went into the temple, giving notice of the completions of the days of purifications under the sacrifices was offered for each one of them. So Paul consented to partake of this ceremony because it did not involve compromising the gospel. By doing this to the Jews, he became a Jew. To those under the law, he became under the law, even though he himself was no longer under the law. So to the Gentiles, to those who are without the law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are the law, without the law. So when he said without the law, those people that are not under the law of Mosaical covenant. So we are not under the sacrificial ordinance of the law. We are not under the Mosaical ceremonial law. So we are not under the dietary law of Moses, but we are under the law of Christ. That is the law of love. And this is the law of the kingdom. So to the Gentiles, he behaved himself as he himself has been a Gentile. This would have both eating what they did, among other things. We know that there are some food that the Jews are forbidden to eat. For example, yung mga isdang walang kaliskis, hindi kinakain ng mga Hudyo yan. No? But probably Paul is eating now for the sake of the Gentiles. The Gentiles don't eat pork. Maybe at this time, Paul is already eat pork for the sake of the Gentiles. So that is how Paul exercises right, the Gentile. In describing Gentiles as being without the law, Paul did not mean that the Gentiles are totally lawless. He meant they were not under the law of Moses like the unsaved Jews were. Verse 20. As a Christian, Paul was not under the law of Moses, but he was under the law. And so in Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So that is the law of Christ. We love God, then we love also our neighbor as we love ourselves. So for the weak, for weak to the weak. To the weak I become weak that I might win the weak. Paul sought to win people to Jesus Christ by being sensitive. The word sensitive, being weak to them, sensitive to their needs, and identifying with them. We should try to reach people where they are today and expect to see changes later. So this is how Paul exercises right to the weak. So this as the If we go back to his teaching in chapter 8, he has the right. Those brethren must be sensitive to a brother who is not accustomed of eating food sacrificed in the temple. Although it's nothing, it is nothing because it is sacrifice in nothing God. No? They are sacrificing that is not really God. But for the sake of a weak brother, we need to be sensitive in doing the things too. No? Sometimes when we teach to the Catholic, we need to be sensitive to the religion while we're teaching them. We should not criticize them until they are converted, and we need to wait to see changes later on. So Paul, to all men, to all things, to all men, and become all things to all men, that I me also means to some to save some. So we should not think Paul changes his doctrine or message to appeal to a different group. He denied this in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 22 to 23. But he will change his behavior and manner of approach to win some to Christ. So this is a part of evangelism, a principle in evangelism. To all men, to all things, to all men. It means that we need to be sensitive to our prospect or audience. So Paul will be anything to bring men to gospel, but he will not say anything that will compromise the truth of that message. So you can always change your approach, your methods, but you cannot change or compromise the message, the gospel. So there are many who were offended because of the message that Paul preached. Before we learn that Paul taught the message of the gospel, it is offensive to those who do not believe. Paul did not mind that his message offended people. He was only concerned that they not be offended at him. Now, this is where your approach should not be offending to other people. Na huwag kang parang alam mo, no? Alam mo yung lahat. May mga preacher tayo na ganyan. No? When they taught, sometimes they are trying to win in the debate or in the discussion with their audience. No? But we can change that approach. But we cannot change the message in order to pagbigyan mo yung yung tinuturuan mo, no? No, you cannot change the message. But the approach to them, we approach or we use entirely different method. Okay, so verses 9, chapter 9, 24 to 27. So it is now an illustration of the race. No? So Paul still in the discussions of limiting his right. So Paul uses the illustrations of the race to portray Christian life in several of his epistles. But here is vividly used here in the Corinthian church. These are illustrations of a race. Do you not know that those who run in all race all run, but only one receive the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. So Paul is pointing out a common phenomenon in all races, on all race, that you run. For example, here in running, you run in order to win. Okay, so Paul emphasized in this verse was on the last statement in it. We should run our race in such a way that we will receive a reward from the judge. In a Christian race, we do not compete with another for the prize. We compete with ourselves. The emphasis here is on self-discipline, not the competition. In a foot race, only one person is the winner. But in the Christian race, all who keep the rules and run hard will receive a reward. Matthew chapter 6, for example, Matthew chapter 6, 19 to 21, and Timothy chapter 2, verse 15. So, his advice, running is not the same as winning. Do you know that those who run in all the race, who run in all race, all run, but only one receive prize. So running is entirely different from winning the race. You may run, but you did not win the race. So winning this spiritual race does not depend upon how fast you run. It is determined by how you run. No? Ito yung number 2, no? Okay. The point here, if any race, there are going to be those who win and those who lose. You don't get the prize because you just run the race. You only get the prize when you win. It is an exhortation to run so that you will win. In other words, in our Christian life, we don't just run. We have the object. We need to win. Our goal is to win. We do not join the race just to run. But our object is to win. So number 2, run to win. Run in such a way that you may win. No? So this is ito sinabi ko kanina. No? Winning a spiritual race does not depend upon how fast you run. It is determined how you run. No? Sa larangan ng mga Kristyanista sa atin, sa Kristyanismo, ay hindi yung mabilis kang tumakbo, kundi paano ka tumakbo. There is a way, there is a right way, and there is a wrong way to run. It did not matter to the player or the team that he ran with speed or style, or that he was sincere. He was running the wrong way. He will cause his team to lose the game. So Paul said, run in a correct way that you may win. So the principle of winning in verses 25 to 27, and anyone who compete in that game exercise self-control in all things. They then do to receive a perishable riches, but we but we and but we an imperishable. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I buffet my body and make it my slave, less possibly. After I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. So in verse 24, Paul exhorted the Corinthians to win. Now he's going to give them a principle of winning. So he does not merely tell them what to do. He tells them how to do it. So winning, the principle of winning, but this is verse 25, hindi ko pa na tapos pa ng basahin. No? And everyone who competes in the game exercise in all things, exercise self-control in all things. They then do it to receive principle. Oh, I read this already. Okay, so the Bible is a very practical in that way, meaning it never gives you a command without giving you an instruction and the sources to fulfill that command. It is the Christian training manual, and it tells you how to win the race. So what I'm saying is the basis of winning the Christian race is the Bible. It gives us the command, at the same time, the instruction how to win. Okay, so the principle of winning is the principle of self-control. And anyone who competes in the game exercise self-control in all things. So the first principle in winning the race is self-control. This is the principle of discipline. So we know that you can, if you want the basketball, if your team want to win the basketball, you need to, this is the limit, you have the self-control. You have to have a self-control of what you eat because it adds to your weight and you cannot jump if you are too heavy. So you cannot drink all that you would like to drink. We have self-control. You cannot go anywhere you would like to go. This does not mean that any of these things are wrong, but you avoided those things because you are running a race. This will not help you to win any race. So by the same token, Paul realized that there are some things that he had to give up in order to win the race that God set before him. Now, sometimes this means giving up our liberty that he has a perfect right to enjoy. If this means the difference between winning and losing, then Paul will give up his liberty, his right, in order to win the race. Meaning, in order to raise someone, that he make this an example in winning a race. The second principle is that the principle of motivation. Then they then do it to receive a perishable riches, but but we an imperishable. So the motivations of the those running here in the Corinthian place, Corinth, they have a, a yearly contest for running, and they are very familiar with that. They are familiar that when you run, taking part of that contest, you are after for a crown of winning. But for a Christian, motivation is not that, not the prize or the crown, but we win for an imperishable crown. So this is the goal that we strive. This is the motivation for all training that we have, that we will receive the crown of life, imperishable. So Paul is saying that we have much greater price. We do not labor for the price. We do not serve the congregations that we have for an earthly price. But we have a greater price. We are striving for eternal price. So the second principle is winning race is the principle of motivation. And we are striving for eternal price. This is much greater than a price that these people are motivating to do. And so what you do today is going to count for all eternity. So the third principle of winning is principle of efficiency. Efficient. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I box in such a way as not beating the air. So the third principle of winning is the principle of efficiency. It requires that all your energy be directed towards achieving the proper goal. And he give us two examples here, illustration to make his point. There is a runner who runs in the right direction, staying on track as he runs the race. And there is a boxer who makes every punch count rather than wasting his effort in swinging at empty space. Hindi lang siya suntok ng suntok, but sumusuntok siya na mayroon siyang tinatamaan. Tumatakbo ka, nasa tamang direksyon. Takbo ka ng takbo, iba naman pala yung tinatakbuhan mo, mali na yung pad mo, yung direction mo. Hindi ka makarating doon sa finishing line. So in each illustration, the point is the same. It is that the effort that is used must be effective in achieving the desired goal. So that's why, in evangelism, in our relationship with our brothers and sisters, we change our approach to them. Those effective approach in order to achieve our goal. To win a brother, so an effective approach, a brother who is weak, is to consider his situation. No? Do not exercise your right because you have that liberty. You don't exercise that liberty for the sake of your brother. And that is the principle of love. No? Pag inibig mo yung isang kapatid mo, na nakikuha ka, no? Tinatawag natin, no? You exit yourself for the benefit of your brother. So the principle of disqualification. I buffet my body and make it myself, less possibly. But I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. So this is the final principles of winning. It is the principle of disqualification, meaning the principle playing by the rules. There is no shortcut in winning. You need to play by the rules. Otherwise, you will be disqualified. So one of the saddest things about any race that it is possible, although you make all efforts in your training, all you exert your all energy to run, only to disqualify because you are not following the rules. There are rules that must be followed in any race or any games, or else the race is forfeit. The same thing, mga kapatid, in spiritual race, we run with some exemption too, no? Or rather, we might be disqualified in our run. Our Christian, oh, wala na. So that is the end of chapter 9. So we have still time, right? So chapter 10, verses 1 to 5, the portrait of failure. These are the example of spiritual failure. For if I do not, for I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were under the clouds and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the clouds in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the spiritual drink, and they were drinking from the spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. So these are example of being disqualified in running. So these are example of Paul. So before that, no. So Paul principle of winning is that you have self-control, motivation, efficiency, and approach. Your approach should be playing by the rules. So you have to run a race. You have a ministry to fulfill. It was given to you by the Lord. You need to fulfill it. There is a prize for that work winning. But it is not easy. But it is worth effort to fulfill your ministry. So here, the example of spiritual failures. The example of running the race, but you fail. So chapter 9, verse 24-27, we run the race. Chapter 10, 1 to 5, the picture or the portrait of failure. So
Chapter 9, chapter 10 na rin. Chapter
Chapter 10
9 na
na
rin.
tayo.
9 o'clock na rin pala eh.
9 o'clock na, tapos na tayo, Brad. Ano?
Chapter 9 ka na eh.
Ano? 7, 8, 9. So, anyway, mayroon pa tayong kunting panahon.
Oh, akala ko hanggang 9 ka lang. Sige, okay lang.
Okay lang?
Palit sa may tambay. Diba saan ako ipapalit sa Mercury?
Okay, so, it said in verse 1 to 5. Nevertheless, most of them, God was not will to yung verse na, no? For they were lay low in the wilderness. So, here is the point here. All of Israel was in the race. Notice the repeated use of the word all. All were under the clouds. All will pass through the sea. All were baptized into Moses. All eat the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink. And so everyone, let me see that, who came out of Egypt was in the race. But not anyone was a winner. Not anyone who won the prize, not anyone was permitted to enter into the promised land. This is seen in verse 5. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. So this is the people who joined the race to enter the promised land. No? So the Old Testament account led us to believe that nearly 2 million people came out of Egypt and went to Exodus. But out of that number, only 2 were permitted to the promised land. Only 2 won the race. Only Joshua and Caleb entered the land of Canaan. Even Moses was not allowed to enter Canaan. The rest died in the wilderness. And so this is how we entered the race with God. They were disqualified because they are not, it is not God was not well pleased to what they are doing. They complained. They committed a lot of sin in 40 years that they are in the wilderness. 40 years. And they just die running the race and not able to enter the promised land. So the purpose of the portrait in chapter 10, 6 to 10, mabilis lang ito, no? Now these things happen as an example for us that we should not grieve evil things as they also grieve. Ito yung mga kasalanan nila, no? And do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor let us act immorally, and some of them did. And 23,000 fell in one day. So here is, nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed with the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. So there is no reason, God gave us the reason why they were disqualified, why they were not able to reach the promised land. Why were so many of Israel disqualified in the wilderness? For listed several reasons. Some of them grieves evil things. Some of them worship false gods and become idolaters in verse 7. Some of them acted immorally. 10:8. Some of them tried to test the Lord. Verse 9. Some of them grumble. So this is the reason why they are disqualified. And this could be the reason some of us will not be able to reach God promised to us. The Israel have the promise to reach the Canaan land. To us, we have a promise to reach heaven. So in each case, they fell into temptation. In each case, the sin, as a result, they were disqualified from the race. The fact that Israel fell in warning, the fact that Israel is they failed to reach the promised land is a warning to us. Paul says that these things happen for an example for us. Verse 10. It is given that it might teach us a lesson. The lesson we need to learn is that it is possible for us to be disqualified in each one of these areas. It is possible for us to be tempted in this area and fall into sin. So on this illustration of Israel in the wilderness is more than just a mere sad story. It is not just merely for intellectual enjoyment. It is given to us for something. It is to teach us how we ought to live. It is not just for Sunday morning race. It is throughout the week. 24 hours we are Christians. We are in the race. It was a lesson that we need to take to work with us and to utilize on Monday to Sunday or throughout the week. Not only Sunday. The race is not only Sunday. It is in every day of our life. Why it is important? Because temptation is going to come on Monday, on Tuesday, and on the rest of the week. It is important that we understand the consequences of sin. The Israelites, some of them, never reached the promised land because of sin. It will not only be then that we will be able to use God's provision. So Israel is a type of the Christian. Exodus Exodus from Egypt is a picture of conversion experience of the Christian. Meaning from the time we are baptized, we are running the race. We are under the rule. We are playing the rule. So just all Israel were under the clouds, so we have all under God's protection. Just as all Israel passed to the sea, so we all have passed the bondage of sin to freedom in Christ. We are free in Christ when we obey him. Just all Christ were baptized into Moses, So we all been baptized into Christ. Just all of Israel eat the same spiritual food. So we had been made partaker with the body of Christ. Remember the Lord's Supper here? Just as Moses struck down the rock so that all Israel could drink from it, Christ died for us so that we can be a partaker and be benefited from his death. So the goal of Christian life is to win the race, to enter into the promised land. The promised land that we have is heaven. But some might be disqualified. Some do not enter in. The reason? Sin. That is the example that we have here. So there are 5 ways in which sin is manifested. Craving evil things. We should not crave all things as they were craved. Idolatry. I do not be idolater as some of them were. Immorality. Nor let us act immorally as some of them did. Tempting God. Nor let us try the Lord as some of them did. Verse 9. Discontentment, nor grumble, as some of them did. And they were destroyed by the destroyer. So the grieving things are actually, this is sin begins with mental attitude. Whatever you move into the realms of sin, your mind is always moved ahead of you. Sin always begins with a desire. It begins with a desire for something that is contrary to the will of God. It begins with grieving for the things which is wrong. That's the first. Craving evil things, desire. So they feel in that they could not say no to their desire. And so we must not lust after things as they also lusted. So the Corinthian Christian who insisted on eating meat sacrificed to idol, even though they lead others Christian into sin. They could not say no in eating food. They said, meat is good, but they could not say no out of love for God and for the love for our brothers. So we need to be sensitive for our brothers, that they might be seen because of us. No? So some people desire a bitter music. What happened? They are instrumental. That is their desire. Craving things that is wrong. So sin always begins with mental attitude. Number 2, idolater, do not be idolater. This is very easy, right? Israel failed to keep focus on God, and they started giving themselves to idolatry, as recorded in Exodus chapter 32, verse 1 to 6, and Numbers chapter 25. And some of the Corinthian Christian, not only got too close in their association with idols, they also made idols out of their own knowledge and their own mind. So idolatry is not limited to graven image. Idolatry, you can be idolater because of your money, because of your family, because of anything that counts first before God. So number 3, immorality. Nor let us act immorally immorally, as some of them did. Israel, in their idolatry, surrendered to the temptation of sexual immorality. The words, some stood up to play. Verse 8. It is quoted from Exodus chapter 52, verse 6. It's a tasteful way to render gross immorality among the people of Israel. We know the Corinthian Christians were having trouble with sexual immorality. In our discussion in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 18 to 20. The context here suggests it is connected to their selfish desire to please themselves, expressed in insisting on the right to eat meat sacrificed to the idol. That is the context here. Number, tempting God. No? Israel, Lord, let us try the Lord, some of them. So the Israel tested Christ, challenging his patience. The best manuscript evidence suggests that Christ, rather than the Lord, is the correct words here. But the difference is not significant. If so, Paul again stressed that it was Christ himself whom both Israel and the Christian were testing. So when we are when we are tempting God, we are actually tempting Christ also, which is part of the triumph God. So the Corinthians are been guilty of tempting God. They have the reason that they have liberty, and they sought to push their liberty to maximum limit. They wanted to see how much of the flesh they could enjoy with it without stepping over the line into the judgment. The reasoning was that since they are saved by grace, they could live as they please. They needed to learn that being a Christian means that you are to live as Christ, as God pleases. Hindi yung sarili mong i-please mo, no? It is God. The same thing, when we worship God, we are not there to enjoy ourselves, to please ourselves. We are there to worship God. We are there to, we're not there to have a concert. Why some people are adding instrument in their worship. They are not there to enjoy themselves of their music. We are there to serve God according to His will. So that is how we are tempting God, because we do things that is not according to His will. So discontentment, this is one of sin manifested. The Israel in the wilderness reached the point where they become dissatisfied with their circumstances. Yeah. Sometimes they said, well, it is better that we live in Israel rather in Egypt. They complain about the test of manna. They complain about the lack of comfort. And they complain about their lot in their life. As a result, they were judged. They were destroyed by the destroyer. They were not able to finish the race because of the complaint. What is wrong for God's being complained? God's people to complain. why it is wrong for us to be satisfied with our a lot in our life. Because when we complain, we expressing dissatisfaction with God's plan. If there's a problem in our life, God sometimes will place it there. Sometimes it is uncomfortable situation, but it is for your good. Kaya ni Michael, mga kapatid si Michael Pilayo, lagi ko naisip yan, no? Nung namatay yung anak niya, alam niyo, nag-a-apply yun sa papunta sa Japan, papunta sa kanyang kapatid. First time nag-apply siya noon, ang bilis, na-approvean siya, no? In other words, meron na siyang president na bumalik siya. Pero nung second time nag-apply sa mga kapatid, hindi siya na-approvean. Dalawang beses siya nag-apply, hindi pa rin na-approvean. Yung pala mayroong pangyayari dapat sa kanyang buhay. Ano nangyari? Unexpectedly, na-worsen yung sakit ng kanyang anak. And eventually, namatay yung kanyang anak. Kung nandun sa Japan, mga kapatid. So, things happen sometimes. What we desire is not what we receive. He decided to go to Japan, but he didn't receive it because somehow God has a plan. He need to be with his family when time he is needed. He was needed by his child. The same thing with us. Sometimes our desire was not given to us. We grumble, we dissatisfied because we not able to have it. But God has a plan. But when you are keep complaining, it means you are dissatisfied with God's plan for you. So, okay, so literacy, the peril of overconfidence. Okay, so meron pa tayong time. These things happen to them as an example, that they were written for our instructions, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks stand take heed lest he fall. So meaning, the value of Old Testament example. Now this thing happened to them as an example, as they were written for our instruction and the ends of the ages. So don't be overconfident. So look at the example. You might be thinking that you will not be full away. We have an example here. They are children of God. God lead them. They were baptized the same as we have. But there is a lesson here that we need to learn. So there is a teaching that going around. These are the teaching for our example. Don't overconfidence. Those other disciples might be said that I will not be like them. Remember Peter? Okay, so remember Peter? He said, I will not be like them. I will never abandon you. He has overconfidence. So the Israelites, God protected them. They were part of the community of God. The same thing with us. No? We are not protected by being baptized into Christ. We should not be overconfident of that. We need to live every day as a Christian. It is not enough. Kaya nga lagi natin sinasabi yung 5 fingers of salvation. No? Ang uli doon ay baptism. Ngayon marinig mo 6 na. No? Kasi ang sabi doon ay be faithful. So, you need to strive to be faithful until death. So that is how the principle here. The warning from the Old Testament example. Therefore, lest him who think is stand, take heed, lest he fall. So Paul gives a warning. It is a warning against overconfidence. It is a warning given to the man who sees the example of Israel in the wilderness and who says, that could never happen to me. It could. You might be disqualified. So verse 13, last verse natin mga kapatid, kasi yung susunod na section is about worship. So verse 10 to 14, chapter 14, chapter 10, verse 14, up to, I think that's 12, is talking about worship. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will provide a way of escape also, that you may be able to endure it. And so we said that do not overconfidence. And so you might be thinking, well, it's hard to be a Christian or running the race. Well, verse 13 give us an assurance, an encouragement, word of encouragement. The commonality of temptation. No temptation has overtaken you, but such is common to man. So the temptation is not unique to each individual or a special exemption that you have. But God reminds us that our temptation is not unique. They are the same. They are common to every man. The same temptation that Christ had, the same temptation that you will experience. Even Christ experienced those same temptation. In Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are. So Christ is a good example for us of the commonality of temptation. He was tempted as we are. The only problem, the only thing is that yet without sin. No? He was not sin because of that. And so that's why, because he was tempted, he understands your problems because he experienced them. This means he is qualified to help you. Christ is qualified to help you in times of temptation because he overcome temptation. The faithfulness of God in temptation. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are. God has a promise to supervise all temptation that come on us to the world, the flesh or the devil. He promised to limit it according to our capacity to endure it, according to our capacity as we rely on Him, not on our capacity relying on ourselves. So there is a limit, actually. Remember Job? God said to Satan, you can do anything except you cannot take his life. So there is a limit to that. So God allowed Satan to tempt Job because he knows Job has the capability. You know the question of Satan to God? Job was faithful because of what you give to him. So God allowed Satan to take everything that Job had or had. That is his capability. Job has the capability to endure temptation because he trusts God. He don't trust himself. He enjoy it because he trusts God. Okay, so the provision for temptation, the way of escape from temptation. So God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will provide a way to escape also, that you may be able to enjoy it. God has promised not only limit our temptation, but also to provide the way of escape in tempting time. He will never force us to use the way of escape. But He will make a way of escape available. Hindi niya ka itutulak doon para makaligtas ka, no? But He give you the option, the way to escape. It's up to us to take God's way of escape. That is true, no, mga kapatid. Meron tayong laging paraan. Sabi nga natin, no, kung mayroon kang, kung gusto mo talaga, may paraan. No, para gawin mo yun. No? Ganun sa temptation. Kung gusto mo makawala sa temptation, meron ka talagang paraan para makawala ka. Kung gusto mo nga, kaya mo. Ganun din, no? Kung gusto mo makawala o maka-escape, God will provide you that escape way. So mga kapatid, next time ay pupunta na tayo sa what do you worship? Ganito sa worship. Ngayon ko, no? So, tapos na siya doon sa discussion about limiting or exercising our liberty. We must be sensitive to our big brother. He gave an example of the race for us. No? So we might be disqualified like the Israelites. That is the example. The example that they were disqualified because of sin. We might be disqualified going to heaven. You see, here, we have given the provision for temptation. We are all tempted like the Israelites in the wilderness. But God will give it a way to escape it. It's your option. Like the Israelites, they were given an option. Only two people, Joshua and Caleb, use the way of God to escape temptation. And so, do you have any question? Nandiyan si Mon, no? Kaya sagutin ni Mon yan. O, siya naman, o siya yung magtanong. Mon, may escape ka. Ha?
Jones.
Okay. So maganda ang
Tanong na lang.
Ha?
Tanong na lang. Para lang mamadali ka. Baka si Brother Jun nagkukuha na eh. Alas 9, no? Overtime ka na eh.
9:30 na
Oo.
kaya. 9:30.
9:30 na. Hindi hanggang 8, 9 lang tayo, di ba? 1 and a half, no? Tama. 9:30, no?
May kasandal mo kaya si Brother John?
Meron
Nakasandal.
pa?
Wala. Martis lang ngayon eh.
Oo,
Kaya yun
nga eh.
talaga. Nakakalimutan niya.
Nakuha ako eh. Nung nakaraang last week, parang nakuha ako, na-confuse ako sa tayo. Ano bang uwasan ko ako? Ano bang time ang aking kwan? I was confused na I should have Tuesday, dito, Wednesday na dyan, no? Kasi sa isip ko, ano ba ang time ko?
Iba kasi ang time frame mo dyan eh.
Nawala ako sa kwan, no?
Normal lang yan. Normal lang yan.
Normal sa
Kung
sinyo.
nakikita natin, Bert,
Oh.
Brother Bert, yung punto ni St. Paul, he does not want a reward or support sa kanyang ministry sa mga kapatiran. In our time, may mga churches na or mga leader, kung isang full-time man o hired na workers, maliit ang kanyang kuhan sa kanya,
Support niya.
support. It is biblical magkuhan siya, maghingi ng commitment. Minsan may narinig natin, hingi siya ng commitment sa kapatiran.
Oo.
Na mag-support sa kanya.
Humingi siya ng commitment kasi nakikita niya kayang-kaya ng congregation na supportan siya.
Hindi nga kaya ng congregation eh. Kung limited lang ang resources ng congregation. Kaya ako minsan, nag-i-kuhan sila ng, o ikaw, kailangan magbigay kang ganito, commitment mo.
Oo. Kasi mga
Pwede ba yun?
Iniisip natin na kung tingnan mo yung buhay natin at saka buhay ng preacher, iniisip natin yung sarili natin, no? Kung tayo ay naghahanap buhay para matustusan natin yung pangailangan natin, ganun ng preacher eh. Meron siyang pangailangan sa kanyang buhay na kailangan niyang suportahin, no? So kung tumatanggap ka ng 3,000 a month, for example, may kailangan tumatanggap yung preacher mo ng 3,000. Kung mo bigyan ng 1,000, paano sa mabubuhay noon? So giving our support to congregation actually is a commitment that we trust God. Yung prinsipyo, the more you give, the more you receive. Yun ang prinsipyo dyan eh. So kung kulang ka, may commitment ka, God will punuan ng Diyos yun. You might be promoted. Huwag mong isipin yung ngayon. Isipin mo yung blessing na ibigay sa iyo ng Panginoon. Or maybe yung trabaho mo ngayon parang hindi mo kaya suportan ang preacher. But because you committed, God will provide you some way that you will earn commission. Hindi mo na-expect magkakaroon ka ng transaction. So that's the way how God works. Trust Him. That's why commitment is trusting God. Not what you are. You trust God that what you committed to Him by supporting your preacher, He will provide it to you. Huwag mo lang isipin, ang trabaho ko, hindi ko kaya, no? God will provide a way for you to fulfill your commitment. Huwag mong matayin ng Panginoon, no? God is bigger than what you think. Mon. Yun lagi natin iisipin, no? Alam ng preacher yan eh. You have the potential. But you are not, hindi mo ginagamit yung potential na yan para makatulong sa gawain sa iglesia. Kung sinasabi ng Mon, ng preacher sa Mon, kasama ka sa akin, mag-door knocking tayo. You have the potential to do it because you are retired. Right? Di ba? So the same thing, he will not ask you to do something na hindi mo kaya. Hindi sabihin mo, samaan mo ako ng alas 9. May trabaho ka eh, bakit kanya yayain? Ganun din ang paningin ng preacher. Ang tiwala mo sa Diyos ay siya magbibigay sa iyo ng paraan para mag-commit ka sa Panginoon, sa Kanya, sa suporta sa preacher mo. Huwag mo tingnan yung sarili mo, tingnan mo yung Diyos.
Wala naman retirement sa Panginoon eh. Wala naman retirement sa Panginoon. Regardless, may trabaho ka man, hindi ka naman sabi mo retired ka na sa Panginoon.
Ibig sabihin, retired ka sa work mo, sa miracle ko, no?
Kasi ang work, pag sinabi mo work, that is,
samahan mo ako sa visitation natin. Samahan mo ako sa ganito. Kasi may time ka na eh. Hindi man niya pwede sabihin kay GC Palak, Jess, samahan mo nga ako sa alas 10 mamaya. May trabaho si Jess eh. Di ba?
Pag sinabi mo trabaho ko yun, that is more on practical. Ang trabaho naman, may mag-retire ka, tuloy-tuloy naman ang trabaho. May trabaho ka sa pamilya mo. May trabaho ka, hindi naman 8 to 5 hours. Siguro yung sinasabi mo, 8 to 5 na oras na trabaho.
Ang punto ko mo ganito, ang isang preacher, pag humingi ng commitment, alam niya na kaya mo magbigay. Nagtitiwala sa Diyos that God will help you to fulfill what you committed. Iba nga dyan, nagko-commit. Sabi niya, akong bahala dyan. Isang lechon ako. Kung tingnan mo, hindi niya kaya magko ng lechon. Di ba? Pero bakit na kaya niya? May paraan eh. Kung talaga may paraan, kung hanapin mo yung paraan, talagang magkakaroon ng paraan. Kung hindi mo talaga gusto, ay talagang walang mangyari kasi hindi ka gagawa ng paraan. Okay, Mon?
Okay. May binanggit si Juan dito. Si Paul, he is in liberty. May mga kapatiran tayo nasasabi na para dinidistinguish nila ang liberal, conservative, liberal. Di ba walang kwan yun? Wala naman distinction na liberal ka man o conservative. Bakit binibigyan ng meaning na gano'n yun? Liberal ang isang side, conservative ang isang side. Si Paul nga, he is in liberty. Pero ang liberty niya sa kalooban ng Panginoon, hindi sa lahat sa pang-personal niya.
Yung context dito, yung liberty not to receive. Is a liberty right to receive support, but he has the right to not to accept the support. So, in-exercise na yung the liberty not to receive compensation from the brothers. So, dito wala yung liberalism. There's no such words in the Bible. Meron tayong liberal. Kasi may mga kapatid tayo sabi niya, liberal ako sa bagay na yan. No? Conservative ako sa bagay na ito. No? There is no such in biblical hermeneutics as liberal or conservative. Right? What is in the text is what you need to do. Siguro, dapat lang tayo maging liberal sa giving. Huwag tayo maging conservative sa giving.
Oo, tama. Limitation. Parang may limitation.
Do not limit what you give to God, because you are limiting God of your blessings. It is more blessings to give than to receive. It's the principle there. Okay, Mon.
Okay. Oras na.
Closing prayer na.
Baka magtanong pa si Ramon ng wala sa topic eh.
Oo nga
Wala
eh.
na. Baka madamay pa eh.
Brother Romel, sino ba nag-prayer kanina? Si Brother kanina, si Brother Daniel. Si Brother Romel, paki-closing prayer, Brad.
Sige. Let's pray. Ama naming Diyos na dakila, magkapangyarihan sa lahat. Muli o Diyos, kami nagpapasalamat sa gabi nito Diyos sa patuloy mo kami iningatan. Patuloy kami nag-aaral sa iyong mga salita. Pamagamit namin sa aming paghahayo, dalhin ang santong ebanghelyo lahat nato para sa kaliligtas ng marami. Salamat Diyos sa bawat isa at patnubayan mo po kami. Tulog. Pagkaluban mo kami ng hindi tulog o Diyos upang bukas ang pagising at taglay naman muli ang panibagong araw at kalikasan na magbubuhat lamang sa inyo. Muli o Diyos, sa pagkakataong ito ay tinatas namin ang aming kapatid na si Rachel Villanueva na nakataglang sa ilalim sa operasyon bukas ng araw, bukas o Diyos sa October 12. Nawa o Diyos ay patubayan mo Panginoon at hawakan mo po Panginoon ang kamay ng mga doktor at nurse na siya magsasagawa ng dakilang gawain na ito Diyos para sa kalusugan at kagalingan ng aming kapatid o Diyos. Pinataas namin Panginoon ang sama-sama naming dalangin ang sabi naming daing o Diyos na sa ikaw lamang Panginoon ang makapagbigay nito. Ito po Panginoon ang lahat ng mga gamot at mga manggagamot o Diyos, mga doktor na sa Panginoon na instrumento para sa operasyon. Salamat Ama at ipuput mo rin Panginoon at palakasin mo po ang katawan ni Sister Rachel. Ganun din po na hindi mag-alala o mapagabag ang kalooban ng kanyang pamilya, kundi magtiwala lamang sa iyo Diyos. At napapurit mo salamat Ama, ay binabalik namin sa iyo sa pangalan ng iyong dakilang anak, naming Panginoon tagapagligtas na Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you, Bro.Bert.
Thank you,
Ang
Bro.Bert.
linggo, wala ako sa
Brad. Saob na si Brother June. Brother Boy.
Static yung
static yung
si Sister Tess. Sira ata si Tess ang iyong mic.
Okay, sige. In meeting na tayo mga kapatid.
Bye.
Town.
Bye-bye.
Bye.